All right, so today we're going to talk some more in general about compositions in a hydrosphere, in a hydrologic cycle. And there's a couple of things that kind of go along with the conversation we were having last time. We're going to talk specifically about how do we get dissolved inorganic carbon, what we call DIC, various forms of CO2 in water. And this is a really just a short discussion just to start thinking about it. Then we'll talk a little bit about how other salts get into waters. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about more specific applications. So a little bit about classification schemes of natural waters and water spirits, primarily on the basis of these kind of things. And then we'll talk a little bit about rainwater and a little bit about river water. Some of the slides at the end of this is just some specific stuff about individual elements that we probably won't have time to go through today. It's just like a little bit more detail about the sodium and chloride and the sulfate and so forth. So if we don't get to it, I'll just ask you to read it on your own. And this basically goes along with kind of the lecture 2 reading plus review that background chemistry stuff if you feel it's necessary. So I mentioned these last time. I just want to mention them again. This is a slide that I pulled out of the chemistry review pack. These are kind of the 4 main forms of carbon, inorganic carbon. Carbon dioxide dissolved, which we call CO2 aqueous, very fleetingly present, very unstable. Kind of as soon as it forms, it immediately makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates to diprotic acid, to bicarbonate ion, and then carbonate ion. Both of those are anions. And we can think about, well, where does that carbon come from in natural waters? And there's kind of these 3 main inorganic sources, right? You can exchange carbon dioxide over the atmosphere. You can get carbon dioxide from the dissolution of minerals that have carbon in it. And you can get carbonate from the weathering of silicate rocks. This one's a little bit less intuitive, but we'll talk about it today in a second. And this is an image from the textbook kind of showing you, carbon dioxide exchange at the air-water interface, the formation of calcium carbonate shells by organisms that precipitate them can affect the equilibrium for carbonate in water in both directions. The kind of export of CO2 from sediment, that's a little bit cryptic on this diagram, but this is primarily from changes in pH that happen as we go down sediment stacks and or biological production. There's nothing biological on this diagram. It's a fair amount of respiration that happens in sediments that have a lot of organic matter. And then direct interaction with calcium carbonate rich lithologies in the subsurface. And they can be layers of calcium carbonate, or they can be things like calcium carbonate cements in minerals. So one thing is missing from this diagram, so I added myself, is photosynthesis and respiration. It goes in both directions, and it is not an inorganic control, but it's a pretty important additional control on the CO2 in both directions. And the key thing about these reactions is that the extent to some of these that they go depends a lot on the pH, right? pH is really low, then this reaction doesn't go in the back direction, the making of shells. It goes in this direction, the dissolving of shells. So if the pH goes high, then we tend to favor this. And this is one of the reasons why we find more calcareous sediments in seawater, which is basic, than pretty much anywhere else in the hydrologic cycle, which is for the most part acidic. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit about the stoichiometry of each one of these things for a second. And then we'll go on and talk about some of the other chemicals that come along with them that help us understand which one of these might be happening. And then that'll lead into this idea of characterizing water with their chemistry. So first thing is to look at the equilibria, right? And so the dissolution of carbon dioxide from the gas in the water, that's a Henry's law process. Does everyone remember Henry's law from somewhere back in the day? Okay. So that has an equilibrium constant, which I've abbreviated KH. We also have this first dissociation, which is basically, the taking apart of CO2. If you recall, there's this intermediate, excuse me, go back to here. this stuff, carbonic acid, which because it's so fleeting, I don't write out that equation. I merge it in. So CO2 aqueous goes to carbonic acid, which then immediately dissociates. So the carbonic acid is kind of missing here to this. So it's that first acid dissociation constant, but it's modified by the addition of that other equilibrium constant. So I just call it Ka prime. Then there's the second acid dissociation of bicarbonate to carbonate, both obviously pH dependent. And then there's the forming or dissolution of calcium carbonate, which we always write in the direction of the dissolution and give it a solubility product notation. So we can take all these equations, and this is done in the review pack, and substitute one into the other algebraically to come up for expressions that relate various things together. Like for instance, I did a calculation using these expressions and the values for those that says, okay, at partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at 350 ppm, which was the value around the turn of this century, around the year 2000, or a little bit earlier perhaps, we can calculate what the pH would be, 5.5. And you can also calculate what was the pH today, now that we know that our value is about 405, 410. It isn't a huge shift, right? It's a shift that happens in the decimal places, actually the hundredth place, but it's a cumulative effect, and that's partly because there's such a huge volume of water out there. And so it's useful to be able to kind of use equilibria, put equations together, remind yourself how the algebra works. As I say, there's a whole slide in the review pack that kind of goes through this in detail. But what we're going to see is that these equilibria work in concert with other reactions that happen in the environment, which affect the hydrogen ions and therefore the pH, and which also affect things like carbon dioxide and calcium concentration to sort of change the relative equilibrium state in different parts of the hydrologic cycle, which is why, for instance, rainwater on average is the most acidic in a normal hydrologic cycle process because it's got most influence of these two reactions and less influence of this. Seawater is the most basic because in a relative sense, it's got a greater influence of this. And then various freshwater parts of the hydrologic cycle on land or in the subsurface have intermediate values. And like I say, these are just the inorganic reactions. Once we had biology in here, right? Photosynthesis consumes hydrogen ions, respiration makes hydrogen ions. That also affects the pH. And we know that, for instance, this process, which is largely governed by organisms in a lot of open bodies of water, has a competing effect where when organisms make shells in this direction, right, they can also consume or produce hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide, which means that they can affect the way this ratio plays out and the way these concentrations affect the pH of water. Okay, so let's think a little bit now about the carbon that comes from these various sources and what that implies for the water, because this is going to go directly into the water classification schemes that we got. So if we take a carbonate mineral in a rock, right, and we dissolve that carbonate mineral, and say for just sake of argument, we want to keep the pH neutral of our water, right? So this is a base, calcium carbonate is a base. The two main carbonates that we have in the environment are calcium carbonate, calcite aragonite are the two mineral forms, or dolomite, which is a calcium magnesium carbonate. It's got maybe 10 to 20% magnesium and the rest of this calcium. So in all three of these primary cases, there are other minerals out there, but they're not particularly common. When we take CO2 and get it into solution by dissolving this stuff, to keep things neutral from a pH sense, we also take some CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So that we end up at the end of this process with 2 bicarbonate ions. So for every mole of this we dissolve, we get 2 of these. And in this, the way I've written it, we keep the pH neutral. So that therefore one of the moles of bicarbonate came out of the mineral and 1 mole came out of the atmosphere. If we look at the interaction of silicate rocks with water and the dissolution thereof, you will also see that even though, and silicate rocks are kind of abbreviated here as calcium silicate, but it could be almost anything. They could be magnesium silicates, they could be, sodium aluminum silicates. It would just change what the counter ions are here. And this was a famous reaction that was proposed by Harold Urey back, I don't know exactly, maybe the 40s or 50s, as kind of one of the major long-term controls of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is that we take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we interact with silicate rock in water, and we get some ions, bicarbonate, dissolved silica. And if we let this process go to completion through the rock cycle, then we end up converting this stuff into calcium carbonate and silica as in quartz or one of the amorphous forms of silica. And the important thing to note here is that the intermediating water has bicarbonate in it, even though there was no carbon in this, right? And so that helps us to understand this long-term control of silicate weathering on the process of CO2 in our atmosphere. This is what happens in kind of the rock cycle as things move from the continents into waters, into the oceans. There's also a reverse reaction, which tends to happen during the kind of plate tectonic cycle of collision and mountain building that converts this kind of rock back into this kind of rock through metamorphism primarily. And so that makes it into a cycle. But for now, what we really just wanted to think about is that regardless of the type of primary mineral in our rock, silicate or carbonate, we're going to pull some CO2 out of the atmosphere and get some bicarbonate in our water. And in fact, if we go along a flow path in the hydrologic cycle from rain into the land surface and subsurface, we're going to see the bicarbonate ion concentration usually increase because of these kinds of interactions. But we don't want to just say usually, we want to be able to check it against something. And so for instance, in this case, we would look at the stoichiometry, right? In this reaction, for every mole of calcium, we get a mole of bicarbonate. We go back to the previous page. For every mole of calcium that shows up in our solution, we get 2 moles of bicarbonate. So there's a difference there. Okay, so then the part that adds to this and makes it complicated is carbon that comes from the biosphere. This can be photosynthesis or respiration. Photosynthesis, in the most general sense, is the taking of CO2 and water and making oxygen and generic carbohydrate. This is a super reductionist way of writing. It's written in the direction of respiration, what we all do, taking organic matter in the form of carbohydrate, reacting it with oxygen to make CO2 and water. Photosynthesis would be the reverse. And when this happens in a body of water, there's also a change in the balance of the amount of CO2 and bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions that come out of this. And we will dissect this reaction in way more detail in a coming lecture. When we add in the stoichiometry of all the other things that are involved, the nutrient elements and hydrogen per se, we'll see that we don't quite have a one-to-one relationship between oxygen and carbon dioxide in this reaction. And we get to see explicitly how many hydrogen ions per mole of this are produced or consumed. But in any event, this happens, and it's another important part of the CO2 cycle. And what you notice is that there's no other things in these reactions, right? There's no calcium or any other ion. So if we have a solution that is dominated by biological activity, we're going to look for carbon in the solution that isn't necessarily associated with an inorganic ion. There will also be pH changes. There may be associations with various forms of organic matter, and that will give us some clues about why that water has the pH that it does have. And there's, I just kind of cutting to the chase, there's a grand sort of competition between inorganic reactions that affect pH and the cycle of life that affects pH. And when we are in a lit environment, the top of a body of water that the sun can penetrate, we're going to find both photosynthesis and respiration. That's just kind of how it works. But when we go to parts of the hydrologic cycle where there isn't light, like in groundwater or deep in a lake or something like that, or deep in the oceans, then we can have respiration, but we don't get much photosynthesis. There are other chemosynthetic mechanisms that can operate under some special conditions, but not at nearly the same capacity in most cases that photosynthesis and respiration happen. And so that changes the balance between how much are we on this side of the equation, which produces CO2, which, as we've talked about, when it dissolves in water, produces hydrogen ions and therefore lowers pH, or whether we're on this side, more on the photosynthesis side, which consumes hydrogen ions and raises pH. So this is a really important thing for us to always be aware of, is how much biological activity is happening, what form is it in, and how does that affect the water. Okay, so now let's just talk briefly about some other ions. So some stuff in the land surface is really soluble and dissolves really easily. Things that precipitate out of water, one of the things that humans do is take a lot of water out of the landscape, use it, evaporate it, maybe not completely, but partially. You think about every time you water your garden, or they water the side of the freeway here, or someone poses down the sidewalk, or the industrial processes where we take water and we're using it to make electricity or anything else, we tend to evaporate, and that concentrates salts. Sometimes the salts get concentrated enough that they precipitate out as little mineral grains. This is common in arid regions. Think about like the arid Southwest, where they grow our avocados and our lemons and all that kind of stuff. They put a bunch of water on the landscape, and some of it goes into the plants, but a lot of it evaporates. And when it evaporates, it leaves little salt crystals behind. One of the things that humans do is increase salt. So next time it rains, that salt can get redissolved, increase the content of sodium chloride and calcium sulfate are the two main salts that come from that. There are some others. But so in waters on the land surface, we can find increases in those kind of elements from this process. It's a both way kind of thing. But as I say, human activities tend to enhance the rate at which salts accumulate in the environment, and therefore the water that runs off environments tends to be saltier if there's a lot of human activity. Then we also have solutes that come from the more traditional terrigenous materials that we think about, the kind of silicate minerals in rocks. Those things tend to have really pH-dependent solubility, especially silica and aluminum. They don't like to dissolve so much around neutral pH. You get the pH really low or really high, both of these guys go up in solubility. If you're around neutral, you know, something like 5 to pH 5 or 6 to 7 or 8, they're not so soluble. So we have really low concentrations of the silicon and aluminum, but all the stuff that's connected to them, the calcium and the magnesium and the sodium, etc., those things dissolve out. And that's that process of incongruent dissolution that we talked about last. So these are our two main sources of inorganic ions. You can find other sources, be sure. Think about fertilizer use, for instance, in agricultural settings. But from a first order, these are the processes. And these are the kinds of natural solids that we find in nature. So silicate minerals, you know, like we find in the rocks around here, olivine, pyroxene, plagioclase, metal oxides. There are plenty of natural metal oxides, iron oxides, for instance, chromium oxide, to a lesser extent, some aluminum oxide or aluminum oxyhydroxide. And then we have these, what I call oxyhydroxide precipitation minerals. Again, think back to last time when we talked about those elements in the middle of the periodic chart that aren't so super soluble, especially in the absence of chelating agents, which is primarily organic matter. So if we have processes happening in an inorganic sense, a great place for this to happen is deep in a soil column in what we call the saprolite layer. We precipitate minerals that have an effect on the pH of things like aluminum hydroxide, boron hydroxide, some silicon hydroxide, various other oxyhydroxides as well. And all of these different things dissolve in water in ways that are sometimes predictable, sometimes not. It depends a little bit on what exact mineral is present and what the chemical composition is. But we can still make some generalizations about stoichiometry, just like we did for calcium and bicarbonate on the last few slides. It helps us understand the relative proportion anywhere in a watershed of this stuff, which tends to dissolve pretty readily, and in the proportion that we find them in the common salts, like sodium chloride is a 1-to-1 ratio. This stuff and this stuff can be a combination of various things. And because of this limiting solubility factor for those two elements, we're looking at other ions, especially ions that don't come along with this. Right? So if there's some ions that don't really occur very much in salts, but they do occur in this, and we see them in our water, we can start to say, oh, okay, we think we're, in a relative sense, dissolving a lot of terrigenous particles as opposed to just redissolving salt. Okay, so here's some reactions. So for instance, these are reactions that look at the balance of calcium. We've already talked about calcium carbonate dissolving in the water. The other primary mineral for calcium that we find in the environment is one of these, what we call evaporite minerals, is calcium sulfate. It can exist as this mineral, CaSO4, which is called anhydrite, but there are a couple of other forms. You're going to have a homework assignment about them, but anhydrite is one form. Gypsum is a more common form. It's got some water in the structure. There's another mineral called basanite. And what you'll see is that both of these minerals, when they dissolve, they make a mole of calcium, but they come with a different counter ion. It's also useful to note that this stuff is a base. So when it dissolves, it changes the pH. This stuff doesn't affect the pH. Sulfuric acid produces sulfate. It's such a strong acid that sulfate's the conjugate base of H2SO4, doubly dissociating. And the pKa, the minus log of the acid dissociation constant, is so high that there's no back reaction of this back to HSO4 minus, which means it doesn't affect the pH. So if we sum up all the calcium that comes out of this reaction, if it's the top reaction, the total moles of calcium that come out are going to be equal to total moles of bicarb. And over here, the total moles of calcium are going to equal to total moles of sulfate. Now, this concentration is sensitive to the pH, so it may go up and down after we dissolve this stuff. This isn't sensitive to pH, so we usually find a one-to-one relationship between those two elements in waters if this is the primary reason for having the calcium concentration. We also have a bunch of incongruent reactions like we talked about last time. So here I've got a sodium and a potassium feldspar consuming hydrogen ions and reacting to make kaolinite clay and some counter ions and some dissolved silica. And so what we see here is that if we sum up the total amount of sodium and potassium from this reaction, it should equal about half the amount of the silica that's liberated. Again, silica is super solubility limited, so we can't just measure silica in a water, say, oh, okay, well, we should have half as much of this stuff liberated, because a lot of the stuff is subsequently precipitated out. But at least it gives us an idea that we see a lot of sodium potassium that's come into solution from these kinds of reactions. We expect the counter ions to be silica. Whereas if this kind of dissolution was the presence of sodium and potassium in a solution were due to dissolution of salts, like sodium chloride and potassium chloride, we wouldn't see any of this. Instead, we'd see chloride coming in. So the third kind of category of reactions, which are the most pesky, and they don't affect us so much in rain and in some surface water, but once we get into lakes and into groundwater, is the last thing I mentioned last time, which is ion exchange and other surface chemical reactions. So especially in places where there's a high proportion of surfaces and a low proportion of water. So think about porosity limited groundwater substrate, where we've got little poopas of water and a lot of substrate, or places where we have a lot of particles in the water, such as when a river changes its flow field very dramatically, such as when it enters into an estuary. We tend to accumulate a lot of particles. They move through the water column, and chemical reactions happen on their surfaces, and they can kind of mess all this stuff up. So we can sort through it at some level, but what we tend to do is recognize that in places with lots of particles, there are other things that can change our simple stoichiometry. And so we have to be a little bit careful when we're in those kinds of environments. But if we can understand the inputs and the outputs from one of those environments, like the water coming in and the water going out, and look at how they change, if we can't account for them with one of these kind of more simple mechanisms, then we start to delve into this. And we know basically we can look at the content of the particles, what the surfaces are, what charges they are, and we can even start to pull out which ions we think are favored for which surfaces. We'll have a whole week where we talk about this process in more detail. Okay, so that's just some really basic stoichiometry, and some of those relationships that you saw on those slides are going to come up now in the kind of main classification schemes that people apply to water. And there's basically, if we go in a watershed, in the Manoa Valley here or whatever, we want to look at how does the water coming out of Manoa Stream vary throughout the year? Maybe this cycle of wet and dry season, or maybe we're having drought some years and not other years, and so we're pumping more water out of the ground, using it, putting it back into the environment, and affecting concentrations of things. These are the kind of four main processes that affect the basic details of water composition. The relative role of evaporation and precipitation, which is basically just going to, evaporation increases TDS, precipitation meaning rain precipitation, not the mineral precipitation, decreases TDS. And this happens in competition. It's happening throughout the day. It's happening, because of human activities. When it's dry, for instance, and people are watering their lawn, they are increasing evaporation. During very wet times, increased precipitation, TDS goes down. Then we have some dissolution of rock. Obviously, this happens at a much slower time scale. We might expect this to vary over some kind of very slow baseline, and this stuff is wiggling really quickly, on all sorts of time scales, diurnal and longer. And then we have to ask ourselves, like, what type of rock do we have in our watershed? Not only what is the rock made of, but what's its texture? Is it relatively high surface area, relatively fractured, in which case it will aid in this process? Or is it very crystalline and dense, and therefore water doesn't flow through it very well, and it minimizes the rate at which this happens? These are sort of the four main things. And so we're going to look at these, how these and the last stoichiometry that we talked about affect kind of what goes into water and how we classify things in a really simple sense. And I will just tell you ahead of time that these classification schemes are things that you learn by programs that you can plug in numbers and it will give you some thoughts, but they're not very good in terms of really dissecting what happens in an environment. But everyone learns about these in their environmental classes at some point, and I feel compelled to go through it. So the first thing to note is what happens when we evaporate water. So probably people have been evaporating water since who knows when. I don't know when they started looking at minerals, but the person who is given credit for it is a 19th century Italian scientist who took seawater and slowly started to dry it down and look at the minerals that were formed. So dry a little bit, filter it out, put on a paper, look at it under a microscope, keep drying it and keep looking at the mineral phases. And he came up with a sequence, which is that the first things that come out of the water are iron as an oxide or an oxyhydroxide, calcium as calcium carbonate. Then as you dissolve it some more, you get some calcium sulfate. Remember the stuff we talked about, gypsum or anhydrite. You get some sodium chloride. And then if you dry it even more, and you got to go pretty far down, you will next make some magnesium sulfate. And then even further, you'll get magnesium chloride, sodium bromide, potassium chloride. Each one of these things has mineral names, and we actually find this sequence sometimes in evaporite deposits, which are large geological deposits of evaporation. You may or may not be aware that the Mediterranean Sea has completely dried out more than one time in the last 50 million years. And there are salt deposits associated with that we can find. And we can see sequences that kind of show this happening. We also sometimes see cases where bodies of water evaporate a lot, but not completely, and we only get kind of this far. And then somehow some water comes back in, and we kind of zigzag back and forth like this. And so this is something that's common in marginal seas. Another place where we find this a lot is in the margins of the Atlantic Ocean sediments, especially in the northern hemisphere. The Atlantic Ocean has also been opened and closed twice. And during those periods of time where it was just kind of opening or closing, it was kind of a restricted basin, we had a similar situation where the water dried out. That stuff then becomes incorporated into the sediments. And because of kind of gravitational instability, it will oftentimes form these dome deposits, and those domes trap oil underneath them. And so they're one of the things that people look for in petroleum when they're kind of exploring for it. But in any event, we can make some predictions on the basis of this reaction happening. If we do a little bit of evaporation, we expect to remove some calcium carbonate and the attendant effects on pH and carbonate ion. If we do a little bit more evaporation, then we expect to also pull some sodium chloride out. There's this competition in the environment between rivers and rain and other parts of watersheds where there's just a little bit of evaporation and there's a lot of evaporation, and what it does is it changes the balance of calcium ions to sodium ions, as well as carbonate ions to chloride ions. So this is one of the kind of master variables in watershed kind of classification. So this is the first watershed classification scheme. It's called the Gibbs scheme. And it's got two things. It's got a mole fraction here of sodium over sodium plus calcium. And it's got total dissolved solids, right? And so it's divided up. These are just the names of some rivers that kind of fit into these systems into three fields: a precipitation dominance field, which has a relatively high amount of sodium and low total dissolved solids. We've got a high amount of sodium because if there's been any evaporation, it's pulled calcium out, but not sodium out. Then a rock dominance, which is a place where we're either dissolving salts out of the water, as I mentioned a few slides ago, or we're just getting primary addition from the rocks, where in essence the total dissolved solid goes up and this mole fraction goes down. And then if we go into arid environments where there's a lot of evaporation, we start to produce some salts, then what's going to happen is the total dissolved solids are going to keep going up, and this mole fraction is going to go back in the other direction, and we're going to end up with things like this. And this works pretty well. You can also write the same exact kind of diagram using chloride and chloride plus carbonate. You can see it's written down here by carbonate. And that comes directly from that Usiglio evaporation sequence. This works okay, but there are lots of reasons why you can have low TDS and a ratio over here that's high that have nothing to do with the processes we've talked about. Primarily, it's the combination of high biomass in the environment and therefore the production of a lot of organic acid and therefore very intense weathering of the rocks in the watershed, which means that when water goes through that watershed, it just doesn't have many salts to give. And so several of these rivers down here, Amazon, for instance, are that way because of that process. So this, this works okay, but it doesn't work great in a lot of cases. So our next kind of more sophisticated classification scheme is called Stallard and Edman. It's very similar to that last one, but it adds in some more stuff, right? So there's now 4 categories instead of 3, and I've color coded them so you can see. So there's something that now fits in between rain-dominated and rock-dominated across this bottom axis. It's basically something that slots in somewhere around here. And it still has total dissolved solids. And it's got some stoichiometry. And each one of these relationships comes from that chemistry that we just talked about 5 or 6 slides ago. So now in addition to the calcium and the carbonate, and the sodium and the chloride, is also looking at the possible influence of the silicate minerals, especially, as well as the kinds of stoichiometry of precipitation, a little bit more precisely for the evaporation paths. This one's a little bit hard to kind of digest. So there's something called extended Stallard and Edman, which takes this stuff and plots it up on a ternary diagram. Is everyone comfortable with ternary diagrams, or is anyone not comfortable? Everyone knows how to navigate these? Okay, I'll just go through it really quickly. So on a ternary diagram, we have the corners represent 100% of that component, whatever it is, and nothing of the other 2. If we're right exactly in the center of the diagram, we have equal proportions of all 3. And you can calculate other proportions geometrically, like for instance, if you were moving along this axis and didn't move up into the field, you'd have some mixture of silicon in this particular case, whatever the component is here and whatever the component is here. Same thing if you moved along this axis. And so when you move along from one apex to another, you're basically looking at a 2-component mixture of the things on the apex. Whenever you migrate out to the center of the diagram, you're looking at a 3-component. So now we've got those same fields on there with the same color codes. And you can see now that there are a lot fewer rivers in that rain dominance field. It's kind of fixed that problem we had from the very high pH. Also, TDS is not shown on this, but TDS ends up kind of increasing in a clockwise way around the diagram. The other 2 things I just want to point out with this classification scheme are, look at the world average of river water. N and P stands for natural and polluted. This is this concept that I've been talking about where humans increase the salt content by taking water out, using it for whatever, evaporating a little bit, concentrating salts. And so it's an estimate that you can see about how much that's moved. But if we look at a watershed that has had human occupation for thousands of years with very intense activities, such as the Rhine, look at the Rhine River natural and the Rhine River polluted, it's been changed fundamentally in how the waters flow, what their compositions are. And that has attendant impacts on a lot of aspects of the chemistry. We're going to talk a lot about the Rhine later in the semester. We'll talk about heavy metals and organic matter. It's kind of a poster child for what humans can do. This is the most sophisticated and last of these 3 systems. It's called Piper diagram. Basically takes everything from the last diagram and the Gibbs scheme and plots it together, right? So we've got a ternary over here that has our cations, kind of like the last diagram, and a ternary here that has our anions. And then we project onto this quadrilateral. And again, it's like, I mean, even myself, I have trouble like kind of imagining how this works. You can just use computer programs that will plot this up. You can find, for instance, Excel spreadsheets that people have made where it will take the concentrations and I'll just pop it onto one of these things using a macro. But what it does is it gives us these 4 fields that help us understand that we have water that can be dominated by, one of these kind of 4 combinations that involve the carbonate and chloride, as well as the sodium, calcium, and sulfate. All the stuff that we just talked about, it helps us understand where do we think precipitation is dominating and evaporation is dominating and rock influences. Okay, so this is just a couple slides that kind of talk about what humans do when we evaporate water. So I've already said it, I'm not going to go through it again. What I want to do now is spend a few moments talking about rain, just in general, and then we're going to talk a little bit about rivers, just in general, get a feeling for how these 2 things represent the chemistry, the simple chemistry that we just talked about. So rain is obviously a starting point for watershed water. Rivers and groundwater at some level affect rain, reflect rain composition superimposed upon by all sorts of processes that happen in a watershed, weathering, dissolution of salts, biological processes, as well as anthropogenic effects, some of which we can track really easily. Some of them are just sort of enhanced natural processes. And both of these things, rain and river water, give us an idea of the relative types of solids that are in an environment that are causing compositions to be one way or another, and that therefore are going to also affect the fate and transport of contaminants that we find in that water. So just a reminder, I mentioned this, I think, last time about aerosols. Raindrops form in the atmosphere by nucleating on aerosols. They're fine little particles. The aerosols can be something as simple as salt particles, as shown here. This is how you would get particles off the sea surface into the atmosphere. Think about a really dry day here where you go and drive out by sandy beach and you're coming along and you can see the air looks kind of cloudy and particulate rich. That's this process going on. And it's enhanced by wave action, and when you're out in the open ocean by more winds, more of this happens. You get a little bit of sea foam, it gets whisked up into the atmosphere, it gets desiccated, it makes little particles. These particles are small. The heavy ones just kind of fall out. But the light ones, which can be, maybe a micron to 10 microns in size, you can barely see them with your eye. They get up into the atmosphere, and then rain can nucleate on them, meaning when water vapor starts to reach its saturation point, it doesn't just drop out of the sky. It usually needs a little particle to nucleate on. And when something like this is really soluble, it does it and it dissolves that stuff. Right, and I talked last time about some of the other kinds of aerosols. We have other kinds of natural particulates, and we have all these anthropogenic particles, smoke, components, for instance, and all sorts of other things. And so when rain forms in the atmosphere, the composition it has is primarily from dissolving aerosols. Now, this one other thing that gets into rain, which are gases, right? So all the CO2 that we find in rain is primarily just dissolving the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's the main gas that we get out of the atmosphere of a substantial amount in a natural environment. Unfortunately, in anthropogenically perturbed environments where we're burning a lot of fossil fuels, we also pump a lot of sulfur and nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere, which also get into rain and make acid rain. Those are the 3 main things that get into rain as gases. Everything else comes in through this way. So the other thing that when we're looking at rain compositions, we can't just go out and stick a little rain gauge out and measure all the rain and expect to get an accurate understanding of the particles up in the atmosphere. So there's 2 processes that happen. We make the nucleation of the drops, they start to rain through the lower atmosphere, and any particles that have been kicked up by human activities, think about cars driving along the freeway or whatever, they get into that first rain. And then as the rain continues to fall, we kind of scrub the atmosphere of that stuff. And so we like to look at what we call the rain out, which is the composition of rain that forms later in a storm. after the lower atmosphere has been cleaned at what we call the washout. It's just a little detail to be aware of. So this is a table, or like it's a diagram actually, of average North American river water and rainwater. So rainwater is shown in the little kind of gray box, river water shown in the white box. These are each of the major ions. It's a comparison, and black is human activities. Okay, and these are the major components of the water. So the fact that we see any black box at all is actually fairly remarkable. The other thing I'll point out is that the bar for bicarbonate ion, it's chopped off. It actually goes up to the next floor, right? See how it goes up to 71 and the scale one goes to 32. So this is way high. We see it in river water, but we don't see it so much in rainwater, right? And that's because all that bicarbonate, in a relative sense, is coming from those rock dissolution reactions that I already mentioned. So yeah, there's a little bit in rainwater, but not very much, not on the scale of this diagram. You can see pretty much everything else increases significantly from rainwater to river water in a particular watershed, and then average across all of North America. And you can see the things that humans have increased, those black bars, and by roughly how much. And they are all the things that we find in salts: chloride, sulfate, sodium, and calcium. And in some places, you'll see this a lot more. Like think about a cold place where they put salt on the road every year during the winter because of helping prevent it from freezing and so forth. You'll see more of that than you will see here. If you look in detail, you'll see, for instance, more sulfate, more magnesium in our rain than you see in a lot of other places. The sulfate primarily coming out of the volcanoes, and the magnesium coming out of the fact that we have unusually magnesium-rich rocks. Volcanic terrains have these kinds of rocks. Most other places don't have so much in it. But the other thing that's kind of interesting to note is that there's a relative deficit of potassium in the river water relative to what we would expect. It doesn't change as much from rain to river water. And this is a peculiar thing we'll see with potassium a lot during the semester, which is that of all the major ions, it likes to stick onto clay particles. It's one of these things that really is affected by these surface reactions. And so because of that, we don't see it sort of as a dissolved solute nearly as much. So if we want to get more detailed than that, we can list out our chemical elements, including those same elements that we had, plus a few other important elements, nitrogen in a couple forms, and phosphorus that are important in life. But we can categorize how do we think they got into rainwater in the first place? How do we think they get into river water in the second place? And what we find is that there's kind of three categories of things. Things that we think come from sea salt, that simple process of desiccation of aerosols. And you can see some elements have a lot of that. Some elements have less. And then things that come from terrestrial particulates, right? There could be soil particles, there could be rock particles or whatever. And then things that come from pollution. And so when we look at water in a watershed, especially rainwater, what we do is start at the beginning of this process, which is say, well, rain nucleates on little particles in the atmosphere. Which kind of particles do we expect to see? If we're near the ocean, we expect the most to see these. So we're going to try and account for all of our ions by doing a budget using these guys. And whatever we can't account for using sea salt as our source, then we're going to look over here. Or we may look at some of these other reactions for some of our gaseous elements. And if we can't account for our composition by this plus this, then we start to look at this, the kind of pollution components. So we find that marine aerosols that form over the oceans and migrate inland a little bit in coastal regions are the main source of composition in rainwater in those environments, such as here in Hawaii. As a storm, a major storm moves from the ocean to land and progresses across the landscape, those aerosols get washed out and removed from the atmosphere. And so additional rain tends to nucleate on a greater and greater proportion of terrigenous particles. So if you're able to follow a storm along, you might be able to see the rain composition change. Instead, the way we kind of track this is just think about how weather systems work overall. And we look at rain collected over the oceans, over the coastlines, over the interior of the country, and we can explain many of the compositional attributes by a change in the proportion of the aerosols that are helping nucleate the raindrop from marine to regions. And when we go into agricultural areas, we can see a lot of pollution components as well. So this kind of summarizes the typical sources of pollution in rain. Pollution in rain can, for the major constituents, is really two things: an enhanced production of local terrigenous components. Think about like agricultural practices, tilling a field on a dry day and making a big plume of dust, plus anthropogenic components, all the stuff that we add to the environment. And these things are dominated by these kinds of land use practices. So we get different kinds of particles in agricultural environments, industrial environments, and places with general urbanization. And we can sometimes see this in the rain composition. Again, in a place like this, where these processes are relatively low compared to other places, and where we get a fair amount of rain, they're mostly muted. It's hard to detect them. You can go to other places, like New York City or Los Angeles, where you can really see these effects very, very dramatically. So what happens with the pollution is that you get kind of more than normal amounts of some otherwise natural things, plus some stuff that's in kind of the wrong proportion. Like a lot of the road salt that's used in places where they salt the road has a fair amount of potassium chloride in it. So you get like a little bit too much potassium relative to sodium for it to come from marine rain, which is a good indication that we're looking at a human and anthropogenic input. And then we ought to get things that are otherwise not naturally observed, right? And this is really common in urban settings. Just automobiles put a ton of weird elements, heavy metals, for instance, as particulates into the atmosphere that get rained out again, and we can detect them. Okay, so I have a couple slides here that explain how we kind of calculate average rain in general. And the way we account for these budgets of marine stuff is to take the sodium and chloride, which is the most soluble thing in rainwater and the most difficult thing to change, the proportion, because they're both conservative ions, as we talked about last time. And we look at those two things together, and we account for the sodium and the chloride from the solution of salts. And then we say, well, using the composition of seawater and the stoichiometry of the dissolution, if we can account for so much of the sodium and the chloride as dissolved seawater, let's account for our other major ions for the same thing. And we'll subtract out the stuff that we think came from seawater, and we'll see what's left. Okay, so this is a table, and it's showing you the ratios of things to sodium in seawater and water from a bunch of different places. All of these are marine settings, right? The South Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic in the west and the east, over the Pacific Ocean, over Bermuda, Hawaii, Amsterdam, which is an island in the Indian Ocean. And these are ratios to sodium. That's why sodium shows up as one, right? So it'll tell you, oh, the chloride to sodium ratio in rain is 1.797. The ratio of sulfate to sodium is 0.252, etc. And if you go through this table, you'll see that the numbers are pretty close. They're not exact, but they're pretty close, okay? And for instance, you can look in Hawaii, and you can see that one of the things that we have high, as I mentioned before, is the sulfate. That's because of our volcanic source. We have enough of it that we see it on average now. Now, when I do this, and most people do these calculations, they would not use a table like this. They would use a different table where the ratio is to chloride instead of to sodium. Because it turns out there are fewer ways to accidentally perturb the chlorine concentration than there are sodium. In terrestrial environments, you can move sodium around without chloride, and so you can get mistakes in your bookkeeping. So when I do the bookkeeping, I use a slightly different table that would have things ratio to chloride, but the concept is still the same. And so how do we do these calculations? We look at the proportion of the ion as it occurs in seawater to whatever we want, sodium or chlorine. I'm going to make the calculation for chlorine. And then we subtract out the other ion that came with the chlorine, assuming all the chlorine came from the ocean. Right, so we have a marine salt component. We have the sodium, for instance, or the potassium or the sulfate that is in the right ratio that we find it in seawater. We subtract that out, and anything that's left over, we say, well, it had to come from somewhere else, if that makes sense. So basically, you take the ion over chloride in seawater, multiply it by the chloride concentration that you actually measure in that water, And then whatever's left over is the amount of ion that didn't come from seawater. So this tells you the ion from seawater. You take the total concentration of that other ion and you subtract that guy off of it. And then you get the non-marine component. And you can have three scenarios. You can have a case where this equation gives you a value of 0, which means, all right, all that salt just came out of the ocean. And that happens a lot here for pretty much everything except sulfate. You can also have cases where the ratio is not, the value is greater than 1, which means we got more of this ion than could have come with chlorine from seawater. We also have cases where the number is negative. And then there's a couple of possibilities. One is like, uh-oh, we're in a place where somehow some extra chlorine got added. It happens in very isolated locations, especially places where there's industrial processes, plastics making, for instance. They can put chlorine in the atmosphere, but it's pretty rare. The other process is that there's maybe some chemical reaction happening in the rain that pulls our ion out, like a solubility process. So that would be common in the cases of like silicon and aluminum if we're dissolving terrigenous particulates, where there's less there than we would predict from the seawater composition because of other chemistry. So this is a contour map of chloride over sort of continental North America. You can see high values off the coast on both sides. And as you move inland, it progressively gets smaller. And there's a really high gradient right at the coast, right? Like here, we got value of 12.5 at Bermuda, and then 8, and then 7, and then boom, all of a sudden you're just in and you're like at a quarter. Same thing on the West Coast, maybe not quite as dramatic because there aren't as many rain measurements out here in the ocean. But the important thing to see is there's a strong gradient this way, strong gradient this way, and a strong gradient this way, the three directions that storms come from. Then once you get to the center of the country, it's like, you know, this stuff is all pretty much the same. There's a little bit of variation, but not a whole lot, because there isn't a lot of sodium chloride source in the center of the country that can kind of bump the chlorine back up. And that's pretty much where the chlorine comes from. So now let's look at the sodium map. And at first blush, it's like, yeah, it's kind of the same, right? We got high here, low here, high here. But when you look in detail, you'll see a lot more variation in the center of the country than we saw with the case for chlorine. Like here's a value that's over 1, you know, and here's a value that's 0.1. Like almost a factor of 10 variation, whereas for chlorine, it's more like maybe a factor of 2. So we can already start to see that, oh, yeah, there's a little bit more going on with the sodium than there is with the chlorine, which is why I don't like to use sodium as my normalizing element. But we can calculate exactly how much extra sodium we have in some of these high sodium places by looking at the sodium chloride ratio. That's done here. So this is taking the sodium chloride ratio and doing that calculation that I just showed you and looking at what we call excess sodium. And what we see is that there are 3 places in the country that on average, when these measurements were made, and this is a textbook that I used to use in this class, this is numbers from the 90s basically. We see zones of high sodium relative to chlorine and zones of low sodium relative to chlorine. And these can largely be attributed to a combination of agricultural practices plus the type of rocks and the particles that are found in these areas, especially here in the center part of the country where we have the legacy of glaciation during the last ice age and the production of a lot of very fine-grained sediments that make up surface soil particles that get whisked up into the atmosphere. They're pretty easy to dissolve, and so we see excess sodium. We don't know that from just the sodium. We got to look at some of the other elements that come along with it, but that's one of the explanations. All right, so this is just a calcium map, similar kind of deal, but you'll see the exact opposite to sodium and chlorine, which is that it's low over the oceans and high over the continents. The calcium budget in rain is much more so dominated by terrigenous particles, the dissolution of things like calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate, as well as primary terrigenous minerals like calcium silicates. And calcium isn't all that high in the oceans, in part because its concentration is limited by the organisms that make calcium carbonate shells. And so we can again calculate out an exact excess and deficit using the chloride concentration. And you could do this for pretty much all of the other ions if you wanted to. I'm not going to go through the details of that calculation, but I will just tell you that of the 2 main sources of calcium, one of them has an effect on pH, that's the calcium carbonate, and one of them doesn't. So we might take a map like this and say, all right, let's look at rain pH, right? And it turns out that a lot of the excess calcium in the rain over here comes from calcium sulfate, whereas a lot of the excess rain, calcium and rain over here comes from calcium carbonate. So we see a difference in the pH because of that. This is the final thing about rain. This is basically a concentration gradient. So some of the elements, sodium chloride, are on this axis. Some of the elements, calcium sulfate, are on this axis. The numbers are slightly different. These are thousands of kilometers from the coast going in along the Amazon. And what we see is that all the elements go down pretty precipitously, some a little bit less than others. And this is this process of marine versus terrigenous particles. But then we also see a huge bump up in sulfate. This comes primarily from biomass burning, deforestation. It's such a huge impact there in the Amazon basin that we see it as a huge spike in the sulfur concentration. And we could rationalize this. We would expect to see a dramatic effect on pH as well, because that sulfur came in without a counter ion, and therefore it probably came in as an acidic. Right, so that's kind of rain in a nutshell. The rest of them we're going to talk about rivers. Again, in a nutshell, we're going to go back and talk a lot more about these processes throughout the semester. But I just want you to think about the fact that rivers dissolve components in two forms, dissolved and suspended. And it turns out that if you were to do like a budget, most of the material transported by rivers is never dissolved, right? In the presence of particles plays a role in what is dissolved and the proportions of things and how they change along the flow path. But the vast majority of most chemicals move through rivers as particles, and that includes anthropogenic particles as well as natural particles. There's also, you can imagine any river you want. They're not all the same. Some of them flow cold and through narrow channels and very quickly or slowly, as the case may be. Some of them flow wide and broad, and maybe they carry a lot of sediment or not very much sediment. Some of them, mature rivers, have very complicated pathways, which affects a whole variety of chemical processes. And we'll see, we're going to later in the semester, we'll have a calculation where we look at how rainwater interacts with kind of river water in a riparian system that affects the time of retention in that environment and the exchange between kind of groundwater and river water, and has a big impact on biological phenomena. But so if we just look at an average runoff from rivers around the world, this is kind of what it looks like. There are places where there's a lot, there's places where it's a little. Some of them are affected by human activities, right? Like the Colorado River used to show up on this map before we put all these dams on it and started using it for our avocados and lemons and everything else that happens in the Southwest. And you'd be right if you looked at this map and said, wow, it seems like the Amazon basin is big, and it is. It's the dominant supply of fresh water from the continents to the oceans. It's more water comes out of the Amazon per year than the next 10 biggest rivers on the planet combined. So this has not only an impact on the land surface, but it also has an impact on seawater in the adjacent areas where we're putting fresh water in. So this is a table of the kind of top 20 rivers on the planet, including the 3 that are tied for number 20. You can see kind of where they are, how much water comes out in cubic kilometers per year, the TDS, the suspended solids, and then some ratios of suspended solids, for instance, to TDS. And so you can see here, look at the water flux coming out of the Amazon. It's huge. And look at its ratio of dissolved to suspended. It's relatively low, right? So a lot of the flow of material coming out in that river, which is so huge, is coming out as particles. But we can look at its total dissolved solids. They're high. They're higher than anything else on this table, right? So the fact that this ratio is low just means there's also a ton of particles in that, right? So that's why we have to kind of look at all these things together. I've just highlighted another one, the St. Lawrence River, which is up in the northeastern part of North America, primarily draining Canada. I think maybe a little bit of US is involved in there too. It's relatively small, but you can see here how it's got a really high ratio of dissolved to suspended. It's flowing in a way that doesn't carry a lot of particles. And you can find all sorts of combinations in between. And so regardless of what kind of waterway we're looking at, we do want to always understand the ratio of what is dissolved to what is suspended and the relative amounts of both. especially because the particulate load can play such an important role on what is dissolved because of these surface chemical reactions that I've alluded to a couple of times. And these will become really important parameters when we talk about SUS. So this is a map of suspended particle variation around the world. It's kind of an older map, so I apologize for the kind of ancient style of coloration. These stippled patterns are the places with the highest. Then black is kind of the next highest, and then successive colors of gray are kind of less and less and less. So again, you can see the Amazon is big, right? It's not the highest though. The highest places are coming off of the kind of west side of the Andes, the Himalayas. And so if you were just looking at the average amount of particles that come off the continent in various places, what you would see is that this is largely telling us where do we have big mountains, recent orogenies. So, you know, we've got Alaska, we've got parts of South America, we've got the Himalayas, plus a lot of this stuff down here in South East Asia. And then, you know, large fluxes in other places, less fluxes in some places. It does vary from place to place. And this suspended load largely reflects the steepness of the terrain, which we can calculate we're using an average river gradient, which is basically just a change in elevation over the change in distance. And this again reflects sort of the youthfulness of the geomorphology, the youthfulness of the landscape, because, you know, the older a landscape gets, the more the relief tends to be reduced by processes of erosion. There are some, I guess I should point out, there are some secondary things as well that affect the suspended load, such as how big is a watershed, what kind of rock is in there, and how warm the water. So the way humans affect sediment load, we can increase it, we can decrease it. So we increase it a lot with our agriculture, especially the tilling of fields. We can increase it a lot by deforesting hillsides and not replenishing. We can decrease sediment load with dams. We can decrease it with bank stabilization. Think about the Mississippi River and its sort of entire southern quarter where the whole thing has been hardened, and that prevents sediment from getting out into the landscape, which is why the land is subsiding there. It needs that natural supply of particles to help keep the land from sinking. This is common in river deltas around the world. The Nile is another place that has this issue. And then in urban settings, we can kind of increase the runoff speed. Think about all the hardened places that we put around, asphalt, concrete, whatever. Water runs through that really quickly. And when it does interact, soil particles, it tends to pick up a lot more sediment than it would normally. It also happens to decrease groundwater recharge. But so depending on the place, we can either increase or decrease particles as well as changing what their compositions are. So this is just another kind of map showing you how humans have affected sediment load. And you can see, you know, places where the sort of sediment load is high and low. And this is the sort of pre-human impact. These are kind of like estimates, obviously, and post-human impact. And I've given you the link to the paper if you want to check it out and read it. But you will see that places that are high are still high, kind of before and after. But there are some places in particular that have kind of dramatically increased their load. There happen to be these kind of bluish colored dots, and where those are from kind of human activity. Okay, and this is just another diagram kind of showing you the kind of relative proportion of kind of pre-human and post-human as a function of the flux per year and the size of the reservoir. And so you can see places where, for instance, it looks like human activities have reduced the sediment load because of trapping of water in reservoirs and so forth and behind dams, and places where human activities have increased the outflow of sediments because of the other types of activities that I mentioned. Okay, so now the last thing we'll talk about is some river chemistry. We want to think about, just like we did for rain, inorganic chemical reactions superimposed on by watershed ecosystem processes, and think about where does water that's coming in a river come from. Some of it comes from rain, some of it comes from groundwater discharge, some of it comes from lake discharge, and these things happen at different proportions in each of those settings. So when we look at the dissolved load in a river, meaning the stuff that's actually in solution, It reflects the local precipitation, it reflects the climate, it affects the amount of local weathering, and it affects the solubility of different ions as a function of temperature, pH, and total organic carbon. And so things like climate and extent of local weathering are heavily linked in with ecosystem phenomena. The more biomass we have, the more organic acids that we stick into water, we tend to lower the pH and we increase the ability to chelate ions. Our sparingly soluble stuff in the middle of the chart becomes more soluble. And so all things being equal in a tropical, highly vegetated watershed, for instance, we're going to see an increase in the total organic carbon, a decrease in the pH, and because it's the tropics, usually an increase in temperature, all those things tend to increase the solubility of some stuff. Other things, not so much in specific examples like silicon, but compare that to something like, go to Iceland or a place where it's kind of cold and dry, and we don't have many plants on the land surface, we're going to see much lower concentrations of things. And this, this is a broad statement, but this is kind of how climate works with watersheds. And of course, whatever the local rock type matters too. Look at the suspended load. It's what is the rock, not only what kind of minerals are in it, but what's its texture, as I talked about. Climate matters. Think about places that freeze every year. We get these freeze-thaw cycles where water percolates into a rock and expands when it freezes, it breaks it up and helps it become weathered and transported as particles the subsequent year, much more so than places that don't freeze. And then we've also got the extent of weathering of our particles. So if we have primary minerals in a rock, some of them are going to dissolve really easily, some of them are not going to dissolve really easily. Depending on what the rock type is and how it interacts with the climate, we can either promote the weathering or not, okay? And therefore change the relative composition of the suspended load from primary to secondary minerals on the basis of those processes, and to some extent the size of the grains. Plus, we'll pick up a lot of organic particulates that come out of watersheds. So this is just a table for a handful of the major elements that we find in the suspended load, kind of average rock concentrations, average soil concentrations, average concentration in riverine particles, the amount that we find dissolved in rivers. These are again averages, the amount of particles in terms of the total load of dissolved, and that just means fluxes in tons. These are in millions of tons per year of dissolved and particulate stuff. And then the ratio, I focus on this last column, the particulate over particulate plus dissolved. So the kind of fraction, if you will. So all the things in purple, aluminum, iron, silicon, phosphorus, they're basically 100%-ish. Right, this is 99.9%, 99.8%, 96% for these last two. Most of these elements move through the landscape as solids. Some of these other elements that are relatively soluble, calcium, magnesium, sodium, okay, the calcium, about 60% is dissolved because 40% is particles. Over here, we got 59%, 36%, just in a broad brush way, we can say about half. Half of these things is dissolved, half of it is particles. Potassium is a special category where it's somewhere in between, again, because it likes to stick onto particle surfaces, as I mentioned before. So that when we look at the dissolved load, we have to realize that processes that cause things to dissolve from particles, if we do anything that enhances the rate of that, like let's say we acidify an environment by human activities, there's plenty of particles in the environment to provide more solute, right? It's always there. Okay, so I have an example of how climate would affect the dissolution processes. It kind of emphasizes some of the stuff that I already mentioned about what does the ecosystem look like and what is the overall biomass in that ecosystem, which contributes to the amount of organic matter in the water. Organic matter in water pretty much always means lower pH and higher chelating agents, higher ligand content, so therefore increased solubility of our sparingly soluble elements. And then another thing that climate affects is sort of how weathering takes place in a physical sense. And so I have an example of taking the same silicate rock, like take up a salt lava here in a tropical environment, in a temperate environment, and what you would see differently in a suspended load from that. And in a tropical climate, we have more intense weathering of the rocks. So we see more secondary mineralization, and therefore we tend to see different proportions of some of the elements that are relatively easy to liberate from rocks during weathering than we find in a temperate climate. So in a temperate climate, for instance, we're going to find greater relative amounts of things like calcium and magnesium and potassium and sodium in the suspended lodes because the rock is less intensely weathered. So another slide here tells us a little bit about rock type from the general classification. This is runoff in a log scale, something called chemical denudation rate, which is basically just the tons of solute per square kilometer of watershed per year. You can see it increases for all kinds of rocks, but that plutonic and metamorphic rocks, crystalline rocks, have a lower curve than volcanic and sedimentary. The world average is here. And that means that some rocks weather more quickly. And if we break out our sedimentary rocks, the ones in this kind of red color, into the three kinds of sediments, siliceous sediments like quartz-rich sandstones, carbonate sediments, and evaporite sediments, we see that dominantly it's evaporite sediments, the salts that we find in the sedimentary record. These can be distributed like we find in soil. They're what caused these kinds of watersheds to be able to produce way more, like a factor of 10 more salts in the water per kind of unit volume of runoff. So the last few slides talk about some specific things, like for instance, this is silicon in water. And again, now we're plotting temperature versus dissolved silicon. And we see two effects here. As the temperature goes up, the concentration goes up because of the solubility of silicon going up, but also the rock type. Volcanic basins, which tend to have rocks of high porosity, high fracture pattern, and relatively high silicon content, water flowing through them picks up more silicon than it does in other kinds of rock locations. And finally, this is a table for each of the kind of major elements we've been talking about that reminds us that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to assign a process to certain ones of these very prevalent ions that are affected by evaporation and precipitation. So that atmospheric cyclic salt is the salt coming from marine aerosols. It can be divided up. There's also weathering of those three types of rocks. And then this final table, which says pollution, meaning in this particular author's estimate, humans have basically doubled the amount of sulfur in water on average coming out of rivers. And we, increased by about 30%, 33%, something like that, the sodium and the chloride. This is that process I was explaining to you about human activities in sodium and chloride. So the next few slides just go in a little bit more detail about, well, where does the calcium come from and the sodium and chloride? You can read it if you want. It's, it's just a little bit more detail, like I say, about some of the stoichiometric relationships. But hopefully this kind of tour through how do we classify water? What are the major processes that affect it? How do we see them manifesting in rain and in river water? Will be helpful context as we move through the semester and start to talk about some of the more esoteric chemicals that we find and that represent contaminants. I'll leave it there and ask other questions about any of this content.
I have a question. Just going back to rainwater, it never occurred to me before, but is there also dissolved nitrogen and oxygen in?
There is, but not very much. So N2, which is the dominant form of nitrogen in the atmosphere, is not very soluble in water.
Mm.
And so, for instance, when we look at the N2 to argon ratio, argon being the third most abundant gas, that argon to nitrogen goes up by like a factor of 2.5 or so. The other forms of nitrogen, naturally speaking, the oxidized nitrogen and the reduced nitrogen, we don't make very much of it naturally. Very, very small amounts. In anthropogenically perturbed environments, we can find more, and it will get into the rain. And when we talk about nitrogen, phosphorus in watersheds, we'll bring this up more, but it turns out that even in places where there's a lot, it's still a little compared to what you get once you get into a watershed, like percents.
In oxygen, I mean, is that a major?
Yeah, there's oxygen at saturation. That comes in, yeah, for sure. But they don't end up kind of affecting, those gases also are exchanging at the surface of any body of water. They're pretty much freely at equilibrium. The gases that really matter are CO2, and then in contaminated environments, we put in a ton of them, nitrogen as what we call NOx, and sulfur as SO3.
Because that would be like adding a higher percentage than what would be naturally gases.
Yeah, and like when we add a higher percentage, it can be like orders of magnitude. It's like so big that the pH just changes completely. Yeah.
How do they get those measurements? You just put an instrument.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you basically